Week after Memorial Day and a day after the 72nd anniversary of D-Day, and at a time when we live in a more and more dangerous world with threats from North Korea, China, Russia, from ISIS, it is appropriate that we're here on the floor talking about our military, talking about helping our troops, and doing so by strengthening our military. Senator McCain, who's the chairman of the committee, just talked about the fact that there's a pay raise here. There's also an assurance to our military that we are not going to have the kind of end strength that puts us in more peril. I applaud him. I applaud Senator Reid for their work on this bill. I intend to support this bill, and I hope we continue to make progress this week on it. But I'm up today to talk about something different, and it's another fight that we have, and that's with this terrible epidemic of heroin and prescription drugs. We now have a situation where 129 people on average are dying every single day. We have in my home state of Ohio and around the country epidemic levels, not just of heroin and prescription drugs, but now fentanyl, which is a synthetic form of heroin. It is affecting every community in every state. This is the 8th time I've come on the floor to talk about this issue since the Senate passed their legislation here on March 10th. By the way, that's every week we've been in session since then, and I came initially to encourage the House to act, urge them to move on it. They have now done that a couple of weeks ago. Now I'm urging the House and the Senate to come together, because we have some differences in our two approaches to this, but for the most part, we have commonality. There's common ground on how to deal with this issue: more prevention and education, better treatment and recovery, helping our law enforcement be able to deal with it. So my message today is very simple. We know what's in the House bill. We know what's in the Senate bill now. We're starting to work together. That's good, to find a way to come together. We need to do that as soon as possible. This isn't like other issues we address here on the floor, with all due respect. This is an urgent one. This is an emergency back home. This is one where we know the federal government can be a better partner with state and local government, with nonprofits. The presiding officer, you, Madam President, have been very involved in this issue over time. You understand it. When you go home, you hear about it everywhere you go, as do I. This is one that affects every single state. That's why, by the way, we got a 94-to-1 vote in this chamber. Think about that. That never happens around here. We were on the floor for 2.5 weeks, and by the end of that debate, practically every single senator who voted said, you know what, this is a key issue back home. I like this bill because it's comprehensive, it's common sense. We need to support it. There's a real crisis out there, and this is a genuinely comprehensive solution to the crisis. We have the common ground. We need to move forward and do so soon. In 88 days since the Senate passed the legislation on March 10th, by the way, more than 10,000 Americans have died of drug overdoses from opioids. And that doesn't include, of course, the hundreds of thousands of others who have not died from an overdose but are casualties. They've lost a job. They've broken a relationship with their family, with loved ones. They've been driven to pay for drugs by going to crime. They have lost hope. There are now an estimated 200,000 in Ohio who are suffering from addiction from heroin and prescription drugs. Now, that's the size of the city of Akron, Ohio, a major city in my state. It is urgent. And by the way, people understand it. There's a new poll out showing that 3 in 10 of Ohioans know someone who's struggling with an opioid addiction. They know people, their family members, their friends, their coworkers, their fellow parishioners, their neighbors who are experiencing the consequences we talked about a moment ago: a lost job, time in prison, broken relationships, communities being devastated. All they have to do is open the newspaper to be reminded of it. Every day the headlines tell the story of families torn apart because of addiction. Since my last speech on the floor about 2 weeks ago, here's some new and bad news from my home state of Ohio. 2 weeks ago, 41-year-old man and his 19-year-old daughter, both from Ohio, were arrested together buying heroin. The same day, a 26-year-old man was found dead of an overdose near a creek in a rural part of Ohio, Lemon Township in Butler County. Last Thursday in Steubenville, police seized 100 grams of heroin from one man. I told the story 2 weeks ago of Annabella, a 14-month-old from Columbus who died at a drug house after ingesting her mother's fentanyl-laced heroin. Last Thursday, a 29-year-old man in Columbus was sentenced to 9 years in prison after his 11-month-old son, Dominic, ingested his father's fentanyl and died. Ohioans know this is happening, and we're taking action back home. The state troopers in Ohio will soon be carrying naloxone with them, which is a miracle drug that can actually reverse the effects of an overdose. Our legislation provides more training for naloxone, also called Narcan. It also provides more grant opportunities for our law enforcement. It's one reason the Fraternal Order of Police has been very supportive of our legislation and provided us valuable input as we were crafting it. Last year alone in Ohio, first responders administered Narcan 16,000 times, saving thousands of lives. Our governor, John Kasich, is conducting an awareness campaign in Ohio called Start Talking. The Ohio National Guard is helping out. They're conducting 113 events across Ohio, reaching more than 30,000 high school students to talk about drugs and opioid addiction. I'm told that 65 National Guard members have now partnered with 28 law enforcement agencies on counter-drug efforts. They've helped confiscate more than $6 million in drugs already, including 235 pounds of heroin, fentanyl, opiate pills. CARA would create a national awareness campaign. We think this is incredibly important, including making this connection between prescription drugs, narcotic pain pills, and heroin. 4 out of 5 heroin addicts in Ohio started with prescription drugs. This is not included in the House-passed legislation as one example of something we want to add, but I believe it's critical we include it in the final bill that we send to the President's desk and ultimately out to our communities so that this message can begin to resonate, to let people know that they should not be getting into this addiction, this funnel of addiction that is so difficult. As you can see, Madam President, we're taking action in Ohio, but they, back in Ohio, want the federal government to be a better partner, and we can be through this legislation. In Cleveland, Cuyahoga County Executive Armand Budish and the medical examiner, Dr. Thomas Gilson, last week asked the federal government to be a better partner with them. I agree with them. They support our legislation. So do 160 of the national groups, everybody who has worked with us over the years to come up with this nonpartisan approach that's based on what works. It's based on actual evidence of the treatment that works, the recovery programs that work, the prevention that works. In Cleveland, Ohio, it's not hard to see why they want the federal government to be a better partner. 140 people have died of fentanyl overdoses so far this year, record levels. Fentanyl is even more potent than heroin. Depending on the concentrate, it can be 50 or more times more powerful than heroin. 44 people died of opioid overdoses in Cleveland in just the month of May. 44 in 1 month. That's just 1 month in one city. That includes one 6-day span when 13 people died. By the way, 18 of those 44 lived in the city of Cleveland. 26 lived in the suburbs. This knows no zip code. It's not isolated to one area. It's not isolated to rural or suburban or inner city. It's everywhere. No one's immune from it, and no one is unaffected by this epidemic. People across the country are talking about it more in the last couple of weeks, and one reason we're talking about it is because of the premature death of Prince, a world-renowned recording artist whose 58th birthday would have been celebrated yesterday. We now know, based on the autopsy of Prince, that it is now confirmed that he died of a fentanyl overdose. Fentanyl is driving more of this epidemic every day, as I said. In 2013, there were 84 fentanyl overdose deaths in Ohio. The next year, it was 503. This year, sadly, it's going to be more than that. The new information about the overdose that took Prince's life has surprised some. After all, Prince had it all: success, fame, talent, fortune. He was an amazingly talented musician. But as Paul Wax, who is the executive director of the American College of Medical Toxicology, put it, quote, "This epidemic spares no one. It affects the wealthy, the poor, the prominent, the not prominent." He's exactly right. This epidemic knows no limits. In a way, as this has become known, it may help get rid of the stigma attached to addiction that is keeping so many people from coming forward and getting the treatment that they need, as people understand that it is everywhere, and it affects our neighbors and our friends regardless of our station in life or where we live. It happens to grandmothers. It happens to teenagers who just had their wisdom teeth taken out. It happens to the homeless. It happens to the rich and famous. Prince is hardly the first celebrity case of opioid addiction. Celebrities like Chevy Chase and Jamie Lee Curtis have been brave enough to open up and talk about their struggles, and I commend them for that. Former Cleveland Browns wide receiver Josh Cribbs recently told ESPN, quote, "I grew up in the football atmosphere, and to me it's just part of the game. Unfortunately, it's ingrained within the players to have to deal with this, and it's almost as if it's part of it. After the game, you're popping pills to get back to normal, to feel normal. The pills are second nature to us. They're given to us just to get through the day. The pills are part of the game," end quote. I'm hopeful that if any good can come out of tragedies like Prince's premature death, it can be that we raise awareness about this epidemic and prevent new addictions from starting. Prevention is ultimately going to be the best way to turn the tide. The House-passed legislation does not include CARA's expanded prevention grants, which address local drug crises and is focused on our young people. But I'm hopeful, again, that ultimately that will be included in the bill we send to the President's desk and to our communities. Madam President, I know that the scope of this epidemic can feel overwhelming at times, but there is hope. Prevention can work, treatment can work, and it does work. Think about Jeff Knight. He's from the suburbs of Cleveland. He was an entrepreneur, started a small landscaping business when he was just 21 years old. The business grew and grew. He was successful. He had more than a dozen employees. Then at age 27, he was prescribed Percocet. Percocet. He became addicted. His tolerance increased, so he switched to OxyContin. When the pills were too expensive or he couldn't find enough pills, he switched to heroin because it was less expensive and more accessible. He started selling cocaine and Percocet to buy more heroin. The drugs became everything, which is what I hear from so many of our recovering addicts. The drugs became everything, pulling them away from their families, their job, and their God-given purpose in life. Within 3 years, Jeff Knight lost everything. He lost his business, he lost his relationship with his family, and he was arrested. But there he got treatment. And through a drug court program, he got sober. He moved into a sober living facility where there was supervision, accountability, and support from his peers. And again, when we're looking at these programs around the country, we're holding up those best practices, and we want to fund those best practices that have that kind of support, not just the treatment, but the strong recovery programs. Jeff has now been clean for 3 years, and he's still got that same entrepreneurial spirit. He's using it now to help others. He's actually bought several houses in Cleveland, which is now turned into sober housing for men who are addicted, all because he got treatment, and he was in a good recovery program he is now permitting others to appreciate. 9 out of 10 of those who need treatment aren't getting it right now, we're told. CARA, the Senate-passed bill, and the House bills both provide more help for the type of treatment programs and recovery that work. If we can get a comprehensive bill to the President, we can help more people who are struggling to get treatment. We can give them more hope. It's time to act, and act quickly to find common ground and get a comprehensive bill in place now so that we can begin to help millions who are struggling. Madam President, again, I appreciate your efforts in this regard, and I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to continue to promote our leadership to move forward, get this conference resolved, get it to the President's desk, and begin to help our constituents back home, all of whom deserve our attention on this critical issue and this epidemic that's affecting every community.